started last week looking at, we did a bit of a review of where we got to, at least a review that overlaps a little bit with the beginning of the Roman Empire. And last week was quite hot.
Yes.
And so some of you were looking a little... so there was a little fading happening last week, and so what we're going to do this week is we'll kind of reinforce a little bit of last week, because I'm just not sure how much of it you actually remember from last week. So we'll see how we go. And so reinforcement's always good. Okay. The big problem is that if you think you can learn something once and then you'll know it forever, well, for most of us that's not really the case. We have to kind of see the process of it. But there were certain things that I wanted to bring up, or that I brought up last time, which we'll have a look at again, and so on from there. So let's just begin in prayer. Lord, we thank you for another opportunity to continue our little journey through the things that happened before you came. Before you came to change that world that we've lived in. But understanding that the world that you changed is still the foundation of so many of the things that we believe and we understand today. And so being able to understand what those things mean and how they impact actually helps us to understand our world today as well. So bless us, Lord, as we continue that journey together in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so the first major date you need to remember about the Romans is
756 BC.
756. In fact, we could actually, I was doing some more reading, and it's closer to 753. But remember that this is actually just a mythological number. Okay, it's actually a legendary number, because it's the legend, of course, of... That's it. Romulus and Remus, and of course we've seen that picture of the two babies kind of suckling off a she-wolf, and of course that's the mythology that we developed about Rome. The truth is, if we could ever get hold of what's called the truth is that of course Rome was a city-state. Okay, so what you had some petty kingdoms. So you had the Samnites. The Samnites and the Etruscans, okay, who were in that Italian peninsula. Okay, in the southern part of the Italian peninsula, you had the influence of the Greeks. Okay, later on, in fact, during the middle period of the Roman Empire, so kind of in the 5th century, that southern part of Italy is actually controlled by the Greeks. It's called Magna Graecia. Okay, so it was under the Greek influence of the Greek empires in the Greek peninsula. Okay, so you can see that there's a number of these petty kingdoms that were there, and Rome found itself a little gap, and then established its own little city. Okay, and remember what I said about the city was established not so much on ethnic lines, but rather on independence lines, on that desire to be independent. A little bit like, as I said to you, about America. Okay, the founding of the United States of America is one of the reasons why people went to America, was because they were sick and tired of the monarchies that were happening in Europe. Okay, so they wanted to go and establish something new, something independent. Okay, and so you can imagine that when you're wanting to establish something independent, your mindset is one of democracy, of a sense of republic, rather than the usual monarchies that you have. And so there's that element of that within Rome. Okay, and that's why for most of Rome's history, at least the BC history, the before Christ history, is a republic perspective rather than a monarchy. Okay, but also you can imagine that one of the things that does is it makes them very diverse, because instead of being a ethnic group, you know, like the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians, what you have is a non-ethnic base. What you have is a base that's based around a common connection, a common goal, which is the city-state of Rome. Okay? Now, that means that Rome actually has that diversity and multiculturalism right from the start. Okay? So it doesn't have kind of like that Greek mentality. Because remember Alexander the Great? Okay, he wasn't actually even Greek anyway. He was Macedonian. Okay, but he's got a mindset. And the mindset is that my culture is
The best.
there we go. That's it. Okay? Because whenever you think ethnically, that's what you think, isn't it? Is that you think your culture is better than everybody else. It's superior than everybody else. And so, of course, when you go and take over those other lands, what are you going to do?
Convert them.
You're going to convert them. You're going to impose your culture on them. It's called cultural assimilation. Okay? Look, if that's Alexander and I've said something wrong, just apologize for me, because I could be wrong. I mean, we're just going from, well, look, the number of times that I'm wrong and have been caught out at it is very few. Yeah, I've been wrong a lot more times than I've been caught, but nonetheless. So the issue with it is, okay, so we've got the Romans who are diverse, but the Greeks are ethnic. So do you understand what I'm trying to say? Okay, so what Alexander does is he tries to convert the countries that he conquered into being Greeks. Into being Greeks. And even though he didn't get much time at it, I mean, he only was around for 16 years, he actually was able to conquer the land, and his successors were able to then continue the process that he began. And so by the time we get to the Romans, the Greeks have already not only taken over that land right through to the Persians, but they've actually made them pseudo-Greeks. Okay, now that's a big deal. Okay, it's a big deal because it affects the way in which the Romans will deal with them as well. Now, because the Romans are not an ethnic group, but rather a collection of different ethnicities, right from the beginning, they don't look at culture quite the same way because they don't have that sense of ethnic superiority. What they've got instead is they do cultural
Assimilation.
not assimilation,
Absorption.
That's what they do. So what they do is that all the people who come bring their cultural stuff to Rome, and Rome sucks it in. A little bit again like the American system. Okay? So what happened in America is that the cultures came to America, and America took the stuff that they felt was part of their DNA, their independence, their democracy, whatever it is, and they sucked in the bits that they wanted from that. The same thing happened with the Romans. Okay? So the Romans sucked in from the Etruscans, they sucked in from the Samnites, they sucked in particularly from the Greeks. Okay? And so a lot of what is Greek culture actually becomes Roman culture. Which is why often when we refer to this culture, we call it the Greco-Roman. We call it Greco-Roman. Because the Romans sucked in the architecture, the geology, the geometry, the technology, even the weaponry.
The sculpture.
Absolutely. All of the art and sciences. All of those things became part of Rome. As Rome conquered, they absorbed the cultures of the people around them. Okay? And as I said, it is a significant issue, because we see that in fact those kinds of cultures often are very long living and very pervasive, because they are absorption cultures rather than independently about their own ethnic identity. Okay? Now, most colonies are absorption cultures, like Australia. Okay? Australian is also an absorption culture. But we do have DNA. Now, you need to understand the difference. Remember that your DNA makes you look a particular way. But it's your environment that makes you live out that DNA, right? I think the same thing happens to countries. is that countries start in a particular way for a particular reason, and that remains to some degree the DNA of the country. But then when new people come in, we absorb their cultural identity, but we absorb it in terms of our DNA. So to some degree, largely, the country stays within that DNA framework. And I think the same things happening in Australia. I mean, there was a time when, Aussies wouldn't have known what pasta was. And then, of course, we had the huge immigration of Italians. And all of a sudden, Australians found out what pasta was, And in the Greek culture, absolutely, we found out, what tzatziki was, and what kebabs are. But I mean, the thing is that you bring in that, and then of course today we've got all the Asian influences. So we've got the Vietnamese who came through, with the boat people, and then we've got the Chinese and the Indians. And what happens though is that we start eating Chinese food and Indian food, and we start taking that as normal. But to a large degree, we don't change the DNA. We're changing the stuff that surrounds that DNA. Okay? Because what we do is we selectively absorb the bits that will add to our DNA. Now the same thing happened with the Romans. They did the same thing. Is that original core of what made Rome Rome is what they absorb from the cultures around them. Okay? So, we've got 753. We've got the connection. When did the Roman Empire cease? In whatever form. What was the end of the Roman Empire?
The hordes from...
Okay, but you're thinking of the barbarians?
Yes.
No, much later than that.
Oh, really?
When did the Roman Empire cease?
The Holy Roman Empire, or
Well, no, the Holy Roman Empire was something else. The Holy Roman Empire was trying to re-establish the Western Roman Empire. But when did the Roman Empire, in whatever form, come to an end?
When the Celts.
When the split happened? Yeah, but you see that was still the Roman Empire though. So it's actually the destruction of the Eastern Empire, which became known as Byzantium. And that was in 1453. 1453. Now look, I know that date is legendary, but if you look at that date and add it to this date, then this is an empire that lasted from beginning to end for 2,000 years.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
That it ended on 53.
Yes, I know. When I read that, I thought, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" But maybe in some ways that's been manipulated a bit. But we'll see. I mean, this, as I say, this date here is a little woolly. It's a little woolly. Okay, because this date is the one that goes into legend. But this date we do know about. Okay, because on this date in 1453, what happened?
There was a big fight.
There was a big
Fight.
fight. Yes. Well, come on. That's the way things happen. Okay.
Just a mad guess.
The sack of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks.
What was that date of that?
That was 1453.
Christopher Columbus was probably just about born then too.
Exactly. Yes. But you can see what was happening on the other side. Absolutely. But yes, this is the sack of Constantinople by the Ottomans, and the Ottomans then, for the first time, really take over. Expand their empire into Europe. Okay, into Europe. But that's generally seen as being the end of the Roman Empire. Okay. Now, I know some of you say, but hang on a second, they weren't really Romans. They were Byzantines, which is true. But the Byzantines, of course, were originally the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay, and so they still had that connection, which leads us all the way back to 753. So what I want to do today is I want to do the timeline, is to begin kind of putting certain things into place so that we understand where things happened and why they were part of that. And we'll link them to some degree with what was happening in the Middle East. So a little bit of what we did last week, but I want to just give a bit more detail this time as well. Okay, so 753 is when Romulus and Remus are around. And of course, Romulus does what?
Kills his brother.
That's it, he kills his brother. Okay, fratricide takes place and Romulus becomes the first king. Okay, and remember what I said, that this is a petty kingdom. Okay, it's a kingdom of really one little place. Okay, so one little city state. Okay, of Rome, and then the surrounding land where they would, grow things and so on and do their things and protect the people on those from anybody else that's coming to take them. But you can imagine that as they drew more people towards them, so more people who had that identity, who wanted to have freedom, who don't want to be under some other organization or whatever, so they would begin to grow. And so what we get is 7 kings between 753 and 509. Okay, 509. And in 509, the last of the kings dies. Well, really gets kicked out in some ways and killed off. And his name was Tarquin. Okay, Tarquin. In fact, it's in Latin, of course, is Tarquinius Superbus. So I'm not sure what Superbus meant. Maybe it was really big. I'm not sure. But Tarquinius Superbus. And he then is the last king. He's ousted. And they then declare themselves to be a republic. And what we get then is the Republic of Rome. The Republic of Rome. Okay. Now, the republic is interesting because it's different to what we would understand as a republic today. Okay, there certainly wasn't what you would call universal suffrage. Okay, today we have universal suffrage. Everybody over the age of 18 can vote, whether you're male, whether you're female, whether you own land, whether you don't own land, doesn't matter. You're allowed to vote. Well, that's not what they had then. Okay, so that's not the republic that they had then. But what they didn't want was they didn't want to go back to having a king. Okay, they didn't want to have a king. And so what they had to do was to work out how to do this. And to find this out, they went back to some of the Greek writings. Okay, they went to some of the Greek philosophers and those boys, and they who were playing with this concept of democracy. Okay, this concept of how do we give the people, but we don't want to give all the riffraff a say. I mean, really, do we? I mean, even today come on. There's some people today that you watch them like on some of these reality TV shows, and you go, these people vote, and you go, really?
And especially not the women.
Not the women. Oh well, you don't want to give the women a vote. Goodness gracious, they might want to be the prime minister or the president. Then I mean, we get into all kinds of trouble. No, so the thing with it is that they looked at is they said, no, we're not going to give everybody the vote. We're actually going to hold the vote only for
Landowners.
Sorry.
Landowners.
No. Land people with land? No. Even more rarefied than that. There we go. We're going to give the vote only to certain families. And these families will be the ones who can trace their lineage back to the originals, to the founding fathers. So the first thing is we're going to give only the founding fathers' families the vote. And we're going to call those guys patricians, which of course comes from the Latin patre, which means father. Okay, so the fathers were the only ones who could vote. If you weren't part of one of the original founding families, then too bad. You didn't get a vote. Okay? In the same way, therefore, if only the patricians can vote, then only the patricians could have the positions of authority. Okay? So you couldn't get into any of the titled things unless you were a patrician.
And how did they decide who were the patricians?
Well, I think obviously you had to prove your lineage. So you had to prove that you were kind of there during the king's phases, you know, during the founding of Rome. So you were one of the first families of Rome.
But there were a bit of corruption, we understand.
Oh no, no, Ken. Oh, a bit of corruption? No, not where human beings are concerned. Human beings never get together and do corrupt things. Come on, wherever there's power, there's going to be corruption. And of course, yes, there was, in terms of who was part of that family, and then they would adopt people, and they would then say that, oh yeah, he's my son, and you know, and then they would give him the name, and so on and so on. And so you ended up with these patrician families. And often they were known by their patrician names. So one of them was called Julii. And we know who the most famous of the Julii is? Julius Caesar. Okay? So Julius actually wasn't his real name. Julius was his family name, his patrician name. Okay? Another one was Scipii. Okay? Scipio was one of his most famous ones, a guy called Scipio Africanus. Africanus means Scipio of Africa. And we'll talk about why he is called that later. But these are old families. So there's Junii, Julii, Scipii. These are all patrician families. And so the early part of the Republic, in the early part of that Republic, what was happening was the patricians were in control. Okay? So you really only had three divisions. Okay? So you had the patricians, you had the freemen. So these are people who were free, so they could still run their own show and do, you know, farmers and plumbers and whatever it is. And then, well, not plebs yet. So you had freemen, you had patricians, you had freemen, and then you had slaves. Okay?
And women.
No, well, they didn't count, because you only talk about men.
They were not in no category.
The women were women. I mean, look, you got noble women. I mean, the noble women were noble women, but they still couldn't hold any office. They still couldn't go to in the military. They couldn't do any of those things. So, effectively, whether you were a slave woman or whether you were the noble woman, you were a woman.
Non-entity.
Well, I mean, look, if you were a slave woman, you were more of a non-entity. If you're a patrician woman, at least you had some authority because you did it behind the scenes. Because let me tell you that, of course, a lot of those patrician men only did what their wives told them to do anyway. So, as has always been the case. You know, I mean, I don't know why women actually want to have the actual authority and title, because you had far more authority and power actually from behind the scenes.
And you don't get the blame.
Well, the thing is as well is that the men think they're in control. I mean, isn't that a big advantage? They think they're in control, and yet they're not. Anyway, but we're going down a rabbit hole there. Yeah. So the thing with it is that, as I say, in the beginning, we've got the patricians. Now, you can imagine that a city-state, as it begins to grow, as you get more families, as things happen, you start expanding the borders. Remember what I've told you before, is that one of the basic reasons for war is...
resources.
Well, that's resources, but why do you need the resources?
Too many people.
Population. Population growth is the fundamental reason for war. Okay? If you can't feed your people, if you can't find them a piece of land, what begins to happen is people get unhappy about that. And so, of course, for the Romans, that's exactly what's happening. And they, for some reason, they've got very high population growth. Now, part of that, I think, was they were happy. I think we're always happier without a king, aren't we? Where we can do our own thing. And I think there's a sense in which the population growth of Rome is actually much bigger and much better than the population around them. Okay? And so what you see is this fairly significant growth of population, and therefore the need for resource. And so they start looking towards the Samnites, who are on the other side of the mountain range that runs down the spine of the Italian peninsula. So the Samnites look after that part. And then you've got the Etruscans, which are in the north. And what begins to happen is that the Romans look at that and go, we could have some of that. And that's what they begin to do. And so the battles begin. Okay? And the fights now for that central and northern part of Italy. And so they defeat the Etruscans, they defeat the Samnites, and extend their kingdom to that area. Now let's just have a quick stop for a sec and ask, in 509, what's happening in the Middle East? Who's the major power in 509?
The Ottomans.
And for a while.
Oh, yes.
Oh, of course.
The Persians.
Of course, we know that all along.
Well done. Persians. The Persians. Remember what had happened in 524? In 524 thereabouts, what had happened? The king of Persia, his name was? The first king of Persia? Not Xerxes? See, that's okay. Don't get worried about that. It's a guy called Cyrus. Remember Cyrus? Yes, I know. You all know an intimate connection with Cyrus. That's good. Yes, Cyrus. So Cyrus becomes the first major king of the Persian Empire. Okay, and he's the one who begins that process of pushing towards the west, of taking over what was originally the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so the Babylonian people. Remember that the Persians. Where's Persia today? Iran. Okay, now remember that Iran is surrounded by mountain ranges. Okay, and so because of those mountain ranges, it meant that they were able to be separated to some degree from the Babylonians. The Babylonians took them over, but didn't quite conquer them. They were able to re-establish themselves. Okay, and of course it was Cyrus who then makes an alliance through marriage with the Medes, and so now we get the Medes and the Persians together, and they then, through population growth again, begin to push against the Babylonians and take over the Babylonian area. And so they take over the Babylonians, and now Babylon is filled with exiles, with slaves who have come from other nations. Because remember, that's what the Babylonians did. Remember that? The Babylonians used to take the head off. Take all the intelligent people, all the thinkers, all the prophets, all the priests, and would take them to Babylon. But of course, Cyrus now he liberates these people from Babylon, and he says, no, we don't want you here. Go back to your own countries. Go back to your own countries and re-establish the structures of your own countries. Because Persia was a bit enlightened that way. Okay, that's how they kept control in their big empire, was to actually give authority and power and freedom of religion to each of the peoples that they conquered. And so the Jews, because at this stage we can call them Jews because they're from Judea. Well, actually from Judah. From Judah. It only gets known as Judea during the Roman period. Okay, but it's from Judah. That's where we get the word Jew from. Okay, it comes from the German, which is Juden. Okay, which is Juden Jew. Okay, but he sends them back in 524. So while Rome is becoming a republic with just that city-state and a couple of maybe other villages, the Jews are going back to Judah. And there they're rebuilding the temple and Jerusalem and the city walls. Okay? So it's interesting that that's happening at a similar time. Okay? So we've got the small group of Jews who are rebuilding Jerusalem. we've got a small group of people who can't think of themselves as Roman, who are now developing the Republic of Rome. Okay, so that's happening one's happening in the west, the other one's happening in the east of the Mediterranean. Make sense? Okay, so that's important to see that happening at the same time. So the Jews are rebuilding their land under the authority of the Persians. Okay, and the Persians don't control Egypt, but they control the Middle East, and they control Asia Minor, and they control the far Middle East. So up to the end, up to kind of the other side of what we would call Iran today. All of that is the Persian Empire. Okay, so
Might be a bit of a red herring. I don't mean
that's okay. We love rabbits or herrings.
When countries or groups of people wanted extra land, was it always by throttling the other country, or did they ever negotiate? You know, like
Oh no, usually they would.
people are invited in as long as they buy.
Oh no! Look, war was a very expensive thing, and it still is today. It's expensive in manpower. It's expensive in terms of supporting a people as well. So often there would be negotiations. I mean, they would send diplomats. There were diplomats in this period.
Because there's plenty of land, really, somewhere.
Oh yeah. Well,
They collect taxes to save them from...
oh yes, absolutely. Well, what you become then is called a client state. Okay, a client state. So it's what the Babylonians did to Judah before they took them over, is that they would go and send an envoy to the place and say, now listen, we the big boys, we've got the army, do you want us to come and beat you up? No? Okay, well that will cost you 100 gold bars each year, or whatever it is. And then they would say, okay, we won't beat you up now, but no, if you don't pay, then we will beat you. So that happened a lot. Oh yes, lots of times there was a warning, and when the warning wasn't heeded, well, then it became in the interest of the invading power to come and take them out, which is what Nebuchadnezzar did in the end to Judah. Okay? And of course Nebuchadnezzar did it to Judah because he didn't want to have an Egyptian ally in his rear when he attacked Egypt. So there's often strategic reasons for taking over, because there's no other reason for taking over Judah. It wasn't a rich country. It wasn't a capable country. It was a little runt of a country. But it had the potential of becoming a bit of a harassment to him in the back of his army when he wanted to attack Egypt. So that's often strategic, is part of the reason for doing some of those things. Okay? Good. So we've got the Romans. They're pushing now. They're moving out into other areas. When you get to about 280, so now we're talking about 200 years later. So 200 years of kind of being, doing the Samnites and the Etruscans and the so on. They begin to look south. So to the southern part of Italy. Okay, that's the part that looks like the shoe. Okay. Now that part was Magna Graecia, so therefore that was the part that had Greek connections. And so of course when they realized that the Romans were now going to start attacking them, what did they do? Well, what would you do? Remember, you're Greek?
Go back to Greece.
Well, what would you do to Greece? Is you go, there we go. You start saying to your allies in Greece, come on, come and
Help me.
help us. Come and help us, because the Romans are going to come and attack us. And that's exactly what they did. And that happened in 280. 280. And the guy who came to their aid was a guy that some of you might know, but you might not know that you do. His name was Pyrrhus of Epirus.
It gets worse. Sounds like a gum.
There we go. See. So Ken knows where we hear about Pyrrhus, but Pyrrhus of Epirus. Now Epirus was one of the petty kingdoms of Greece, of the Greek peninsula, on the west coast of Greece. And he came out with 25,000 men. And not just men, he came out also with elephant.
Elephants. Oh, that was.
And this was the first time that Europe had seen elephant in action. Okay, in war. And so what happened? Is he won. He won the battles because the Romans had no clue how to fight elephant. Okay. Oh, well, just imagine it for yourself. I mean, and we're not talking about little Indian elephants, okay?
No.
Okay, we're not talking about Indian elephants who are nice and cute and got small ears and the whole thing. We're talking about the African elephant, okay? We're talking about big boys with tusks, okay? Those were the boys that came across, okay? Imported from Africa, okay? Because of course, elephant, don't come from Greece, just in case you thought that they may have. They don't. They come from Africa.
Did they have some sort of armor on them?
Yeah. Well, well, a part of it was skin. I mean, a lot of the things like arrows and stuff like that did nothing to them except made them angry. And angry elephants were not all that good as well. But the issue is that these elephant were brought across from Epirus to the mainland in Italy, and they started fighting. And the thing is that Pyrrhus actually won. He won battle after battle after battle. He pushed the Romans back. But what he thought was going to happen was he thought that the nations that had been already defeated by the Romans, so that's nations like the Etruscans and the other Samnite nations, would actually join him as allies to eliminate the Romans. But they didn't. So what it meant was that he was fighting a battle, or fighting battles, away from his supply line. He was fighting in a whole different peninsula to where he came from, which meant that he couldn't get support. He couldn't get new soldiers. And so every battle that he did, yes, he won them, but he lost so many soldiers that in the end, he couldn't hold on to what he had won. And that's where we get the English expression, a Pyrrhic victory. It comes from Pyrrhus. A Pyrrhic victory. Okay? A Pyrrhic victory means that yes, you won, but you've lost so much in the process that what was the point anyway? And that was the truth. And so what happened is that the Romans had to fight elephant. Now this is going to become important soon after this. Okay? Soon after this it's going to become important because there was another nation that also used elephant. And that nation was Carthage. Hannibal and his elephant. But we'll talk about that soon. But the thing is that they also used elephant. And so, but now the Romans had to learn how to fight against elephant. And so what did they have to do? They had to develop new weapons. Bow and arrow didn't work. Coming at them with a sword, well, you don't really want to be that close to an elephant. Okay? So what do you have to do?
Dig big holes.
Dig big holes. That's pretty good. No, it's pretty good. And they did actually dig big holes as well. So that was part of it. But what were the two things that would get hold of elephant?
Big long spears.
Spears. That's right. They invented the javelin. Okay? So actually using javelins. Because the whole thing with elephant is you don't want to attack them when they're already with you. You want to get them long time before. And of course a javelin, you could have a much bigger point to it. Okay? So you could kill the elephant before they actually entered into your lines. The second thing is that elephants don't like
Mice.
I think you're thinking about Fantasia now. I've got a good image in my head of dancing elephants on ice. But no, it wasn't ice, but in fact the opposite. Fire. Oh, mice. Oh, you said mice. I thought you said ice. No, mice. Again, Again, far too much Walt Disney there, actually. Again, far too much Walt Disney. Actually, fire. Elephants don't like fire. And so what they learned to do was to use fire barriers and to actually use fire arrows to enrage the elephant, so that what it would do is actually turn around and stomp Pyrrhus's their own guys. Because of course, the elephant isn't looking at this going, oh, is that my guy or is that your guy? Oh, it's your guy? Whoa. No, he just looks at guys, I want to get out of here. And so in fact, sometimes the elephant create more problems than they achieved. But what you need to understand about this is that this was the beginning, in many ways, of Roman weaponry and warfare innovation. What they did was they saw an issue, something that they couldn't at that point deal with, and they had an industry that then began to come up with ideas of how to deal with it. And so what you get is technological innovation in warfare. And this will be the cornerstone for Roman work after this. Okay? And it happens with this invasion. Okay? That this invasion was very scary for the Romans. It was a very scary invasion. Almost as scary, but I think actually more scary, was an invasion that was coming from the north. Also at a similar period, in fact slightly earlier, and in fact happens all the way through, right through until just about the turn of the millennium, are invasions from the north. Now north of Italy, there's the Alps, right? And the Alps form a fairly natural barrier. But who lived on the other side of that?
The Germanic.
Well, they weren't Germanic at that stage, because the Germanics were on this side, on the eastern side. But who was on the western side? No, that's further east. Who was on the west? Bunch of groups. We now call them Celtic. Okay, we call them Celtic tribes. But these ones on that side are particularly known as the Gauls. Okay,
What's France called?
The Franks. What's France called? At this stage, France is called Gaul.
The France.
That's right. But remember, France comes from the word Frank. And Franks were not Gauls. Franks were Germans. I know, if you keep telling the French that they actually come from Germans, they go, what? No, we don't. Yeah, but anyway, the thing with it is that the Franks were actually one of the Germanic tribes that took over Gaul. And then intermarried with the Gauls that were there. And that's where we end up with French. Okay, we end up with the French. Okay, in the same way that you've got the other Germanic tribes who stay in that area who become the Germans over time. And not just the Germans. There's no such thing as a German, actually. Because remember, Germany didn't exist until the unification by Bismarck in the late 19th century. So, we have to get over the fact that we call people things when in fact they've always been something else. And we have that same argument in Australia. That we all came from somewhere else. Even the people who were first peoples came from somewhere else 65,000 years ago, but they came from somewhere else. And so that we all came together and became Australians. It's the same concept that happens elsewhere. It's just about how much time is involved in the process. Okay? But what we see here is the Gauls. Now the Gauls were tribal people, and they repeatedly came south into the Italian peninsula and sacked towns and villages. Even Rome itself. The Gauls actually sacked Rome a number of times before even this period took place. So you can imagine that what you've got now is you've got the Greeks attacking from the south, and you've got the Gauls attacking from the north. What's your reaction going to be?
Ally with one or the other.
Ally? Yes. Oh, I like that, Ken. You're a strategic man. Absolutely, yes. Let's make an alliance. But now let's say neither of them really want to ally with you because the Gauls don't like you and the Greeks think you're inferior. So what are you going to do instead?
Bribe
bribe them. Again, I like your strategic thinking there, Ken. I like that. But you don't have all that much that they want, because they know that they don't have to take it from you as a bribe. They can just take it. Yes, right. They can just beat you up and take it anyway. So why would they take the bribe?
Take them against one another.
You could do that, but they're really quite far away from each other. What you have to do is you have to build a
wall.
No, there was nobody called Donald at all in this situation. Okay? No, what the issue is what you have to do is you have to build up your army. You have to build up your army, and you have to go to war. Now, in many ways, what they did was when they took over the north of Italy, what they did was they fortified the north of Italy so that it would be fortified against these Gaulish incursions. Now, the Gauls never attacked them with big numbers. It was always like raiding bands. And so in many ways, you kind of took that as just a normal part of living on the frontier. The south, though, was different. The south was a major army in people like the Greeks. So therefore, you had to stand against them. And the only way to stop them from doing this was to defeat them. Now, the way in which the Romans defeated Pyrrhus was to make the fight so expensive for him that effectively he had to go back to Greece. And that's what they did. And as soon as he went back to Greece, the Romans took over the whole of the south of the land. And so what you end up with is that by around about 264, so by 264 BC, the Romans now control the whole Italian peninsula. Okay, they control the whole of the Italian peninsula. And now what's going to happen? Once you control the whole of the Italian peninsula, what are you going to do next?
Expand.
There we go. There we go. What you're going to do is you're going to want to keep pushing the boundaries. Okay, you're going to keep pushing the boundaries. And how are you going to keep pushing the boundaries? Well, you're going to start with the places that are closest to you. And the closest to them was Spain? No, the closest to them was let's try and put an I there. Sicily. But here's a problem. Sicily is consistent of half of Sicily is an independent state called Syracuse. And the other half is controlled by the big empire of the time. And that's Carthage. Carthage. So Carthage has half of its Sicily, and Syracuse has the other bit. Okay? And so if you're going to expand, you need to have what you call is a casus belli. Have you heard of that word? Casus belli. Now the word belli in Latin means
Beautiful. Good.
not bella, that would be the Italian. War. Means war. And causus means, and that's where we get the word cause from, so it means a I think that might be yours, Ollie. You're going to just let it go? Okay. So the reason for war. You need a reason for war. You can't just go in and do that, because otherwise everyone in the world's going to look at you and go, oh, these warmongers. So now what's happened between 509, when the Persians have been in control, and 264? What's happened in between in the Middle East? Okay, we've had the different kings of Persia. We've had Cyrus, and then his son Cambyses. Now I know you all know that one. Oh yeah. Oh yes, I remember Cambyses. Now Cambyses. The reason why Cambyses is important is because he achieves what Nebuchadnezzar couldn't. he destroys the Egyptian empire. Okay, one of the longest running empires of the world. Okay, remember that the Egyptians had been an empire from the building of the pyramids in 2500 BC. Okay, the Egyptians have been there from 2500 BC all the way to Cambyses. Okay, Cambyses, he gets knocked off, as so often happens. Okay, and he gets knocked off by the head of his guard, a guy called Darius. That's right, Darius. Okay, and then Darius takes over, and he becomes the big boy. And not just he's the big boy, but he's the one who expands the Persian Empire into Asia Minor and so on, and through the process and so on, and pushes through to the Greek peninsula, and tries to take over the Greek peninsula, but fails. And so then he hands over the mantle to his son.
I can't say it, 60 hours.
That's it, Xerxes. That's right, Xerxes. And Xerxes then tries also to take over the Greek peninsula, but fails. And then we go to Artaxerxes, and then we go to Xerxes the second, and then we go to Artaxerxes the 15th. No, it doesn't get that far. But anyway, we finally get to the point where the Greeks then say, no, enough, you're not going to stand for these guys anymore. Once the Greeks then take over, they've had their fight with Sparta. So that was what was called the Peloponnesian War. And that's all finished. And now it's all been unified under Alexander the Great. And Alexander goes, well, first his father Philip, and then he goes and takes over the land of the Persians. But of course he dies at the age of 32, so not much of an impact, huge impact, but he didn't stay around all that long. And then he divides his kingdom up between his generals. Okay, so Ptolemy gets hold of Egypt and some of the Middle East. You get Seleucus, who takes over the Middle East and the area out towards India. And then you got Licentius and so on, Lysander and so on. Anyway, you take over Pontus and take over Asia Minor and so on. So that's what all been happening while the Romans have been taking over Italy. Okay, so while Italy has been taken over by the Romans, the Greeks are dividing themselves up into these little kingdoms after Alexander. Okay? Does it give you a sense of connection? What are the Jews doing?
Watching.
Well, the Jews are actually living in the Holy Land. They've gone from having the Persians as their overlord to then having the Greeks as their overlord. And unfortunately, the Greeks are not as benign an overlord as the Persians. Because what are the Greeks trying to do? They're trying to convert them. That's right. Okay, so the Greeks are telling them that they actually now have to speak Greek rather than Hebrew. They're telling them that they need to worship some of the Greek things and so on. And we're going to see that get to a head in about 150 BC. Okay, so in about 150 BC, they're going to throw their toys out the cot about that whole issue with the Greeks. But the Greeks are in control in this period all the way through until about 63 AD. 63 BC rather. 63 BC, when the Romans will now expand into the Middle East. But at this point, in 264, the Romans come into contact with the big empire of the time. And the big empire of the time is Carthage. Now they're called Carthage because of the name of their main city, okay, which is the main city in Africa itself. Now, I told you last week where they came from. Where did the Carthaginians come from? Where did the Carthaginians come from?
North of Lebanon.
Not north of Lebanon, actually right in Lebanon. So where Lebanon is today is where they originally came from. They were called the... Let's try that again. I think that's an I, actually. The Phoenicians. Okay, the Phoenicians. Okay. Now the Phoenicians, I've told you, was also an ancient people. They were the ones who figured out how to make boats. And as I was saying to you last week, part of that is because of where they lived. They lived in an area with Tall trees. Okay? I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Jews were never known for their sailing, because they didn't have any trees. I mean, if you've only got olive wood and grapevine, well, you're not going to make boats. Okay? It's not going to be the big thing that you're able to do. Okay? In fact, if you've only got lots of rocks and high mountains, what you're going to invent? Oh, let's invent a new religion. No, that was just a joke. But anyway, the thing with it is that the Phoenicians are able to do that because they've got those big cedars and they are able to make boats, and they learn how to do boat building of galleys, and then they move those galleys all around the Mediterranean, and they essentially become the transport company for all the areas. But as I told you last week, is that it's no use having ships if you don't have somewhere for those ships to dock. Okay? You need to have trading posts. And so what would happen is the Phoenicians would set up trading posts all around the Mediterranean. One of those trading posts was a place called Carthage. And what Carthage did was, as it attracted people, it became its own city. It then began to run its own government, and then it became an empire. Now, Carthage, at the time that we're talking about in 246, controls most of North Africa. Okay? So not Egypt, but the western part of North Africa is controlled by Carthage. And then the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain. Okay, the southern part of Spain is also controlled by Carthage. So too are the two islands just off Sicily called?
Crete.
No, that's on the other side. Sardinia and Corsica. They're little islands, but come on, that's where Napoleon came from. So I mean, it's got some history. It's got some history there. Okay, so the thing is, yes, Sardinia and Corsica, and then, as I said, they've got half of Sicily. All of that was Carthaginian. Okay, so we're talking about a major player here. We're talking about, in fact, the major player in the Mediterranean. The two players was on the west part of the Mediterranean, you've got Carthage, and on the eastern part of the Mediterranean, you've got the Greek states. Okay? So at this point in history, you've got Carthage versus Greece. And then you've got the upstarts right in the middle. The Romans. Okay? But now, you need to remember this, that the Carthaginians are the successors to the Phoenicians. So what's one thing that they knew how to do?
Ships.
They knew how to build ships. And so they controlled the Western Mediterranean by virtue of their ships, the naval warfare. Okay? Naval warfare was what they were good at. And so what you need to see now is that in 264, what is the casus belli? Well, the casus belli is that the Carthaginians want to expand. Okay, and so they want to take over Syracuse. They want to take over the whole of Sicily. And this gives the reason for the Romans to get involved. Because the Romans can come to the aid of Syracuse. Now, it's not real aid, because in fact they're going to just take over Syracuse themselves. But it's the concept of it gives them the reason to go to war. And so they go and they attack the Carthaginians. And what it develops is a 20-year war. 20 years of war. But in that time, what is the one major thing that the Romans realized?
They had to build some ships.
They have to build some ships. The Romans didn't have ships. Okay, I mean, yes, they maybe had, a couple of ships that they would do some trading with, but they didn't have the battleships that they needed if they were going to take it to the Carthaginians. Okay, remember that the Romans' methodology of war was all on land. They were good at fighting on land. The Carthaginians were good at fighting at sea. But now, if you were Roman, what would you do?
you would go in and get the
Times something.
best boat builder from Carthaginian offspring.
Or,
Well, the town.
let's say you couldn't get the best boat builder, what would you do instead?
Steal the plans.
Yes, that's what you would do. You would steal the plans. And that's exactly what they do. Because what happens is that the Romans get hold of Carthaginian, in a battle, they're able to get hold of one of the Carthaginian triremes. So that's a trireme is a 3-level of rowers. They get hold of the trireme and they take it back to the port of Rome, which is called Appia. Okay, and they take it back there and they copy it. So steal the plans. Oh, I love it. Industrial espionage, alive and well. Remember what I told you about the Romans is that their favorite thing is cultural absorption. They will take from other cultures what they need for themselves. And that's exactly what the Romans do. So they steal the plans and they make the ships. And off they go with all these brand new ships and they go and attack the Carthaginians. And they lose.
Didn't know how to sail.
Well, you see, that's the thing. Why? Because you see what you're doing is you've got an army-based culture fighting against a navy-based culture. I mean, the Carthaginians knew how to do naval warfare. They knew how to run their ships. They knew how to attack. And when they attacked, their sailors knew how to respond with arrows and so on in terms of being able to sink the other guys. What did the Romans know? The Romans knew how to be an army. So now what would you do? Retrain. Yes, you could retrain people, but remember that you're not a sea people like the Phoenicians are. You are a land people.
You lure them onto the land.
Yeah, and if you were Carthaginian, you would be silly to do that, which in fact is exactly what happens, but later on. What do you think?
Well, they might steal a couple of
Learned sailors, and so that to teach them how to be sailors. I don't think you could do that because remember what I've told you before about the fact that peoples have got a DNA. There's a DNA of warfare as well. And the DNA of warfare for the Romans was very much an army-based warfare. So what do?
You take the long way around to Carthaginian by foot.
Yes, and in fact they did that as well. By the third war, that's what they do. Now, what you have to
attack the country by Italy.
Yes, yeah, so
Big error.
well, there was a big error from the Carthaginians to do that, to actually come over land, because they negated the very thing that they did best, which was sea warfare. Okay, but it was because the Romans were attacking Spain that Hannibal came across. But anyway, we'll talk about that just now. You know what you have to do? Is you have to make your boats into land.
Make them into land.
Now, don't land them, but make them into land. What I mean by that is don't put sailors on them, put army on them. And then when you attack the Carthaginians, you need to make a system whereby you can get your soldiers onto, well, not onto land, but onto the Carthaginian ships. And then they can act like soldiers, like army. And that's what they did. So what they did, and look, we had to learn, we learned that again during the Second World War. In the Second World War, the Americans developed that concept, particularly, they were called Marines. So Marines were soldiers who could fight either on the sea or on land. That's what the Romans did. So the Romans took legions and then took soldiers from those legions and put them on the ships. But now, what's the big problem?
How to get them in onto the other ship.
There.
Pirates have boats.
Barry, you are a strategist at heart. That's exactly the problem, is how do you get them from the Roman ship onto the Carthaginian ship? And they invented this thing called a corvus. And what a corvus essentially was a ramp, which while you were sailing your ship, you had it up, and it had 2 spikes in the top of it. And once you rammed the Carthaginian ship, you would drop the corvus. And because of the spikes, it would actually bite into the wood of the Carthaginian ship. And then the soldiers, with their full armor and shields and everything, could begin to cross on the bridge, and then, using army techniques, take over the Carthaginian ships. Do you see what I mean by weaponry technology? That what the Romans were good at was seeing a problem and then finding out a solution. And the corvus meant that the Romans could use their speciality in warfare, which was the army. They could use the army on the water, and destroyed the Carthaginians through that. Okay? Of course, what they then did is that once they had understood how to do a trireme, they then started, doing more levels. So you get the quadrireme, you get the quintireme, you go all the way up to a hexareme. And then it goes to a decime, where you've actually got 10 levels of oars. How the hang they didn't all kind of mess with each other? I mean, it would just look like a complete disaster area. But and can you imagine how many slaves you had to have on one of those ships in order just to propel it anywhere?
An oar long enough to reach the water.
Well, they obviously did.
Because were the oars longer? Is that how they did it?
Yeah. Well, that was part of it. And also the angle of the ship. So instead of having a ship that was like that, you ended up with a ship that was like that. So that you could have...
That's why they're building the ships now, like that.
Yeah. But as I said, they kept on rethinking the way in which you had to make the ship in order to do it, in order to support the kind of thing.
Short slaves.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, Charlton Heston was quite tall. No, anyway, let's...
He wasn't really.
Yeah, well, look, if any of you have seen Ben-Hur, you'll see him doing his thing. But so what I'm trying to say is that you end up with wars, and these wars go from 264 till 146.
Oh, wow.
So for 120 years, the Romans and the Carthaginians are... Can you close the back door, please? So for 120 years, they start fighting with each other. Now look, they're not fighting for 120 years. They're fighting in 3 separate engagements. And those 3 engagements we now call the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars. Okay? Now, where does the word Punic come from? Well, it comes from the Latin name for the Carthaginians. Because the Carthaginians, remember, came from the Phoenicians. And so the Latin name for them was Puny. No, not P-U-N-Y, no. But I think it's, maybe it was may have even been a Roman kind of joke, but no, that's English, so it won't do. But puny. So puny becomes Punic Wars. So it's essentially the wars against the Phoenicians. Even though they really weren't Phoenicians anymore, they were now their own thing. They were the Carthaginians. Okay? So the Punic Wars. And there were 3 Punic Wars. Okay? 3 Punic Wars. So the first Punic War was the war for Sicily. Okay? And that was concluded 20 years later with a peace where the Romans got hold of the whole of Sicily. Okay, so they added Sicily, and then they added Corsica, and they added Sardinia to Rome. Okay, but then of course the Romans said that's not enough. We want more, because of course once you've got something, you want more. And so the Romans looked for the next place which looked like it was a good place to get something from, and that was Spain. Okay, Spain has always been a very agricultural heartland, a bread basket for lots of different things. And so in fact they looked at Spain going, oh, lots of good stuff there which we can get hold of. And so they wanted to attack Spain. But of course, when they attacked Spain, that was owned by Carthage. And so the general or the leader of the army at this stage in Carthage was a guy called Hannibal. Okay? He was part of the royal family. I think the royal family was, I think the surname is Barca. B-A-C-A was the name of the family. And Hannibal was the leader of the army of that family. So he was Hannibal Barca. And the idea with it is that he then decided that he was going to attack Rome. But because Rome had been attacking Spain, he decided instead of attacking Italy directly, he would protect the Spanish interests. Okay? It wasn't Spanish at that time. Remember, the Spanish also come from the barbarians. Okay? The Goths ended up in Spain, particularly the group called the Ostrogoths. Okay, end up in Spain, but that's later on. So the concept of a Spanish person is again an amalgam of different tribal groups who become the Spain, which is why today Spain as well is in such a mess. Okay, because it really depends where in Spain you're from. The Catalonians are different to others. Well, they think they're different, put it that way. And then you get the Basques, they're very different again to the others. So remember, there's lots of influences in Spain, because there's the Moorish influence as well, which happens later on with the Arabs. So lots of changes happening in that area. But at this point, the Carthaginians have the control. So Hannibal is getting rid of the Romans, and so he decides that he's not going to stop there. He's going to actually travel overland to Italy.
With his elephants.
With his elephant. Oh yes, with elephant. And so he's got elephant, and he's got a big army, and they've got to travel. And he's the first one who is able to take elephant over the Alps. Okay? But at huge cost again to his army. He loses actually a fair percentage of his army. But he wins again. And in fact, he wins at a major battle. It's called the Battle of Cannae. I think it's the other way around. Cannae. Okay, the Battle of Cannae. And then he wins a number of other battles. And in fact, he ravages the north of Italy for the next 11 years. Okay? Ravaging the environment, pillaging and raping and doing all these things in the northern kingdom. But in the end, he has the same problem that Pyrrhus has. He can't make that decisive victory. He can't finish them off. And so in the end, he has to get into his boats and go back to Carthage.
With the elephants.
Well, I'm not sure there were many elephant left by that stage. I think most of them now are archaeological exhibitions. So, I think it would be quite fun. Can you imagine that would be quite fun actually if you're somewhere in northern Italy and you're doing a bit of a excavation and all of a sudden find a tusk or something. You go, oh look, there's Hannibal's elephant. But no, so I don't think there were many elephant left. In fact, he didn't have many men left by the time he did that. And so by the time we look at this, he goes back to Carthage, really not having achieved a huge amount, other than to remind the Romans that they were vulnerable.
What year was this again, Rob?
So this is somewhere in the middle of this. So about 180. Okay, is when we see that reality. Okay, and so what happens now is we realize that the Romans realize this whole concept of an army and so on. We need to improve our army. We need to improve what we're doing. We need to have a standing army. We can't just have an army that we pull together every time someone attacks us. We need to be able to do this. And this is when they then establish standing armies. Okay, the legions and the standing legions. Okay, where in fact you go and you become a soldier for 20 years. For 20 years, and then in reserve for another 5. So essentially your commitment to the army is 25 years. I mean that's quite a commitment to have. But there's a carrot at the end of that. And the carrot at the end of it is citizenship. Is that you can become a citizen by virtue of serving for 25 years in the army. Okay?
Only 1 in 100 got there though.
Well, that's it. Well, you don't tell them that. I mean, come on. What kind of advertising are you doing, Barry? I mean, really, you don't advertise that you're all going to die. You advertise, just think what you can be when you get through 25 years. The fact that you can either die from disease or from wounds inflicted. And in fact, most of the time they didn't die from wounds inflicted. They actually died from disease and from just the reality of being on campaign. I mean, it was a tough life to be a soldier, and we'll talk about that in the subsequent week. But that was the idea. But what this also began to do was to develop a new group within the society. This group in society now were no longer just farmers and the ordinary little freemen who didn't own anything. It was actually people now who had money in order that they could buy land themselves. So they could actually own land. And in fact, they were even buying land from those original patricians. And so what we did was, what was happening now was a development of a new class. So you had the patricians, but then you had this new class. I suppose today we would call it the middle class. Who had become or were becoming landowners. And that class was known as the plebeians. The plebeians. And that's, sometimes we call it a pleb. Now today we use pleb incorrectly because we say, oh, they're just the plebs, as in they the low group. Yes. But that's not the case in Rome. The plebs were actually the middle class. Okay, so you had the patricians, you had the plebeians, and then underneath them you had then just the ordinary free people. And then of course right at the bottom, in fact not really even on the same scale, were the slaves. Okay, and now remember, after every attack, every war, you ended up with more slaves. Okay, because a lot of the people that then were captured, they were made into slaves. Okay.
Could slaves ever become plebeians?
Gee, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
As a reward for special service.
Look, I think generally the slaves could become free people, but most of the time they never became citizens. Because remember that plebeians were citizens. And so the concept of citizenship moves as well. So could they? I suppose theoretically they could. But I don't know of any particular ones. I'm sure there might be some stories out there. Maybe that's a challenge to you there, Tony. Go and find out if there's a slave who became a plebeian. Okay? But the thing with the plebeians, of course, is that just like in our countries, once the middle class gets hold of some money and some land and some power, they begin to demand their rights. Yeah, that's it. They want to be able to vote. And so, of course, what begins to happen is that the vote changes in the Republic from being just the patricians to being patricians and plebeians can now begin to do the voting. And of course, not only that, plebeians can now also become some of the high levels of the society as well. Okay, things like military tribunes and so on. We'll talk again in a later week. We'll talk about the different levels or different kind of positions that you can have. It's very confusing, but it's wonderfully complicated. And so we'll talk about that. But the plebeians and this happens through warfare and through the growth of the empire, that you end up with this middle group. But even through all of this, though, remember it's still a republic. There isn't an emperor. There isn't a king. I mean, there's a short time when somebody decides to become the dictator, but they get rid of him quite quickly. And the rest of the time, it's based again in elections. And notice that their elections for their consul, which was their top position, was every year. Every year. And they didn't only vote for one, they voted for two. Which is really quite interesting when you think about it. It's a good way to keep democracy on track. Because, if you're going to have corruption, you now have to have corruption with two people rather than one. And actually doing it every year means that no person gets too much power over the time. And so you stop the dictatorships from potentially happening. Okay, so it's quite a clever. I think it's one of the reasons why in Australia we still only have a 3-year federal, to make sure that we keep on turning them over, so that we don't end up with anybody who kind of. We drain the swamp, yeah. I say nothing to that at all.
Merchant bankers out of politics or things like that.
Yeah, but you see, maybe that's the problem though. Look at our merchant bankers. Maybe they've been in those positions too long. That's why we end up with the corruption we do. Okay, so the thing with it is that we get to the Second Punic War. So the Second Punic War is really a stalemate. Nothing really changes. But in between the wars, the Romans have taken over parts of Spain. And now all that Carthage has left is North Africa. Okay? And so the Third Punic War breaks out. And this is the one where they say, enough is enough. We are going to take them out. We are going to destroy Carthage. Okay? And the guy who gets given the job to be the military leader is a guy called Scipio. Okay? Scipio. He's the consul at the time, and he gets the nickname Africanus because he goes to Africa, okay, with the legions, and he besieges Carthage and destroys it. And when I say destroys it, you need to understand, destroys it. I mean, not one stone is left on another one. And then once they've destroyed all the stones, they then pick up the stones and spread them out so that no one could rebuild it. And then they take salt. Now remember that in fact salt was a very valuable commodity, but they take bags and bags of salt and throw it over all the arable land around Carthage. It's called salting the land. So that nothing could be grown there again. I mean, come on, now that's vindictive, eh? I mean, that's making a point. That's saying to the world, you mess with Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. Okay? This is what's going to happen to you. I mean, it is unbelievable. But essentially, the Romans completely annihilate the Carthaginian Empire.
Population as well.
Well, they killed a lot, and the rest went into slavery. Yeah. Now, look, Carthage was on the decline. Even in the time of Hannibal, it was kind of, on the decline. And so by the time they do this, it's kind of at the end of the process. But the ruthlessness of the reorganization of the Roman armies was unbelievable. But you need to realize then by 146, they now are the masters of the Western Mediterranean. From Spain all the way, well, not Gaul, okay, so they haven't taken over Gaul, but southern France, and then into the whole Italian peninsula and the islands that are all part of that, plus North Africa. All of that is under the control of Rome.
Mari Nostro, Italian.
Oh yes, that's right. Yes, what it means. Yes, the whole sea. That's right. The Mare Nostrum. Yeah. So all of that sea of Mediterranean now becomes under the Romans, and you need to see what the big reason for this is, or what the big driving force is. The driving force for Rome is. What's the driving force to get rid of Carthage? Remember what I said to you before? So one of the major driving forces of humanity and of civilization has been, right from the Stone Age, has been trade. And remember that by getting rid of Carthage, the Romans now control all the trade in the Western Roman Empire.
shows.
What they actually got, yes. Yeah, what the roots were, yeah. And we've started finding some of those. One of the great things that are happening as well is that as they do archaeological work in the Mediterranean itself, we're actually finding some of those old trading ships that had sunk. Because of course there's lots of storms on the Mediterranean and lots of little islands, which of course when a storm happens, the potential for getting yourself taken out is quite high. And so we've now found lots of these old ships still intact. Well, some of them partly intact. There's one that they found, which I thought was fantastic, is they followed the amphorae. You know, an amphorae is the clay pots that look like this. Well, they found one pot, and they went, "Oh, look, there's a pot," and they thought, "That's weird. There's a pot." But then they looked a little bit further, and they found another pot. And this was like breadcrumbs because it led them all the way to the ship. And obviously what had happened was that the ship got caught in a storm and they started throwing out all the amphorae as the ship moved. But in the end, the ship was overwhelmed and sunk and they were able to collect all of this. And so we've got quite a lot of knowledge about what they ate and so on because some of those amphorae were still intact. And I suspect some of them may have been, did you see? There were some of those kind of things that were there at the Wendy talked about the fact that there was an exhibition at the
National Museum.
It was the National Museum, in Canberra, from the British Museum of the Roman Empire. Did you see that as well? Oh, so you went?
Canberra.
Yeah, you went to see it as well. Okay. Oh, so every now and then that comes. I'm quite fortunate. I actually went to see it in the British Museum. So that was yeah. I'm very, that's fortunate, isn't it, to be able to go there. But yeah, to actually see some of those artifacts which we've now found and the connections with them. Okay, so I think we need to kind of stop there because what we're going to do is to stop at 146, and then we'll talk about what happens next. Because at 146, something is happening in the Middle East. In fact, just a few years before that, something's happening in the Middle East which changes the way in which Israel think of itself. What's happening in the Middle East?
Well, tell us.
No, I can't just tell you because that takes away the suspense, Tony.
So that's the time when that happens.
Okay, so when the Romans are essentially becoming the masters of the Western Roman Empire, or the Western Mediterranean, in the East, the Maccabees have overthrown the Greek Empire of Seleucid. Okay, Seleucus IV and Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, so they've overthrown him and they've got independence for the first time since the time since 586. Okay, so that's in 400 and something years. It's the first time they've got independence in 400 and something years, and they will hold that independence for the next 100 years until the Romans take it away from them. But now think about that. That means that they defeat Carthage in 146. 100 years later, well, less than 100 years, 80 years later only, they've already reached the eastern end of the Mediterranean. In only 80 years later.
8 or 80?
80. Which in this time is very short. I mean, only 80 years later. They've gone from 509 when they became a republic of just a little city-state. By 63 AD, 63 BC, so that's only 440 years later, they've taken over the whole of the Mediterranean. And they've destroyed both of the big empires who used to control it, which were the Carthaginians and the Greeks, in only 440 years. I think it's quite an amazing rise. It's you could call it a meteoric rise, except meteoric usually comes down rather than up. But anyway, that's okay. A meteoric rise in the power of Rome at that point. Okay?
Patience is a virtue.
Patience is, well, I don't think they were, look, I think that what they did was phenomenal in the time span. It was actually very quick in many ways. But they end up with an empire which spans Spain to Persia, from England to North Africa.
Big.
21% of the entire population of the world is in the Roman Empire. So 1/5 of every human being in the world is in the Roman Empire. That's phenomenal. And the impact is unbelievable. And we'll talk about the impact in subsequent weeks as well. Okay. So we'll stop there. And next time we'll carry on from 146. And then I know we're going to go into AD. And I know this course was supposed to be about BC. But the Roman Empire, of course, straddles both of those. And so I want us to kind of get a sense of what happens to the Roman Empire all the way through. And so that we get a kind of in our head of how things develop from there. Okay. So thanks very much.